Today I'm going to talk about how to take the old version of the UIQuestMenu GUI and upgrade it to the newer version. So before I start talking about it, I just want to show you what exactly I'm talking about, or which GUI in particular I'm going to be upgrading. So this is the old version here of the GUI, and this is the new version of the GUI. And we'll see how far we can get. I'll probably, in this video, I'll probably just explain what this GUI is used for and how the code is using the file information to actually render and make the code, make it useful for questing and stuff like that. Because these menus are used for talking with NPC. So one example of that is if I go up to this NPC and right click on them, you see that you get this kind of dialogue that gets opened up, and then you have multiple options that you can click on and stuff like that. So first, what we're going to do is talk about how this old version works and what we have to do in order to get this version to work. Okay, so first we're going to look at where this file gets loaded. Okay, so this is the user interface editor, and you can see I've loaded the co_questmenu.uif file. Each of the UIF files are placed in the uis.tbl. So within this table file, you can see that the 49 string here points to the quest menu, and that's this file. So one of the first things I think to notice is that just using the user interface in general, you have these different components. So you have this button here that's used to close the GUI. You have this scroll bar here. So if the text goes over, you can scroll down and read the rest of it. This text menu, which is the different options that the player can choose from. The text title, which is what the NPC is actually saying to the player. And then there are these three images here. This is the right menu image, so image our menu, which is this little piece of image right here. You have the centerpiece right here, and then you have the left piece of this. So you can imagine that for each option the player can choose from, we'll need to basically there'd be two ways of possibly doing it. One, you can copy each of these three images and then render an identical copy underneath for each option that the player can choose from. Or what we'll be doing with the old code is basically just stretching these images so that they cover all options that the player has to choose from. In the newer code, we'll write it so that it's actually copying the texture information. The reason for that is because this has an actual button, so you can't just stretch the image because it will definitely not look right. There are three more images to talk about, and these are the bottom images. So we have the bottom center, which is just this little piece down here, the right of that, and the left of that. So these three images are important because after we've added all of our options, then we need to offset those three images to the very bottom to make it look like a full, complete, covered GUI with this outside rim here. Okay, so in the file, we have information about what the component is and this ID string here. This ID string is important because when we jump over to the code, that's what we use to actually gain access to the C++ object, um, uh, so that we can control the functionality of these UI components. So over here you can see we're grabbing the text menu. So the text menu is the text where the option the player can choose from gets put. We grab a pointer to that object. The object is a cn3 UN string object. And then we do the same for the text title. So this is where the NPC, what they're saying to the player, gets put. And then as you can see, we do it for the 3 images that I talked about, and then the 3 bottom images I talked about. Okay, so now we have access to all of these objects, and we can modify properties of those objects and the way that they're being rendered, so on and so forth. Here at the bottom, we're basically saying if we have these pointers to these images, and so image left, image right, image center are the 3 images that are behind the text object, the text option, which the player can click on. So once we have those, and we check to make sure that they aren't null, and if they aren't null, then we get the region, which is the rectangle. So this, you can see this pink rectangle here. The region specifies where the top of this is, the bottom, the left, and the right. So if you know that information, you know everything you need to know about the rectangle, and you can tell the width and the height by subtracting, say, the right part of the rectangle from the left part of the rectangle, and that'll give you the width. And we'll do that shortly. So we have this information. This information persists. So basically we're saving it to these properties of the object. And the reason why we're doing that is because for these 3 images, these are the 3 images that will be stretched. And they're stretched depending on how many options the player can click on. So that's why we're giving them special treatment, as to say. We're basically just saving these properties to the class. And so this is the class header. There's a couple things here that we'll talk more about shortly, but you can see here are the 3 rectangles that we're using. Okay. So this is where the actual UI file gets loaded, and we gain access to all the objects that have been created. So this GUI is now good to use. It doesn't actually get rendered until the player right-clicks on an NPC. And so that's what this code, this open method here does. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through what this method does. And then in future video, we will rewrite this code so that we can use the new UIQuestMenu GUI. Okay, so let's go through this line by line. So first we do the init base, and we can, so here's the init base method, and what this is doing is it's basically just clearing the information from when we previously opened this GUI For instance, when we previously right-clicked on an NPC, when we right-click on an NPC next time, we don't want any of that information like still hanging around, because the text options will likely be different unless you click on the same NPC twice. But this is just a way to basically initialize all of the memory for this particular object. So what we do is we set the number of the menu options to 0, and for all of the possible menu options, we check to see if that text for the option the player can click on, if it exists. So this is a check to make sure this pointer is not null. If it's not null, then we delete the memory and we set the pointer to null regardless. And we do that for all the options the player can click on. And once that's done, we make these checks just to be sure that we actually loaded the components when the UIF file was loaded, and we make sure that they aren't null. So if none of these objects are null that we loaded previously, then we make use of the packet information which the server sent us. So you can see when this method gets called, you have to pass a data packet and an offset. And so this is a network packet that the server has sent the client after the client has right-clicked on an NPC. So the client right-clicks on an NPC, it sends the server a packet basically saying, hey, look, this is the NPC that I clicked on. What should the NPC say to the player? And this, the server replies with a bunch of information that we can use to basically create an NPC response. And this is the code that's actually creating that response. So from the packet, we get which NPC did we click on, the index, into the quest talk TBL. So the server doesn't actually send the full paragraph which the NPC is saying to the player. It just sends an integer saying, look, open the TBLs, go to this row, and use the text that's there. So it's a lot less information that's being sent over the net. So it's good on bandwidth. So what this line does is it takes that index, it searches the TBL for that particular row, and it passes a pointer to a structure, which is all the columns for that row in the TBL make up different properties of this struct. If this pointer is equal to null, then we just return, because we don't have a row in the TBL that corresponds to that index, so there's nothing we can do. So we just don't even display the menu at all. However, if we did find a row, then we get the string. It's just basically what the NPC is saying, and then we set the string for the UI component to the text which the NPC is saying. So this text comes straight from the TBLs. So this pointer to the text title is this string component for the UI that makes up this box here. And the string which we found in the TBLs gets displayed here in this box. Okay, so that takes care of what the NPC says to the player when they right-click on them. What we still need is all the string for the options that the player can click on after the NPC makes a statement to the player. The player then needs to make a decision, and in order to do that, they need options. Um, so what this code is doing is it's setting the number of menu options to 0, which is this line, and then for the maximum possible number of options, it grabs an integer from the packet which the server sent us. This integer is an index into the UIQuestMenu TBL, and this works very similar to the Quest Talk TBL. So all TBLs are just files that contain structure information. So for this struct, if we happen to find a row, then we look at the SC menu column, and that's a string, so we can set that string to an array so that we know which option corresponds to which string, and then we increment the total number of options that we have. So now we have the text that the NPC says to the player, and we've set that text on the GUI so that it's being displayed in this box here. This code here, what we did was we grabbed all the text for the options, but we haven't displayed those options to the player. We just have the string information, the character arrays, and we've saved that information. We've used the packet which the server has sent us to grab those strings from the TBLs, and we have an array that contains all of those strings. But we still have to put those strings into the GUI object so that the text actually gets displayed in game. So if the total number of options is 0, then we just return. We set the GUI visible. This is setting those images. It sets the images back to the original rectangles that we had when we read in all of the GUI information. So if you remember, this bit of code here gets the original rectangles for the GUI, which is these rectangles here, those 3 rectangles. And every time this gets displayed, as I mentioned earlier, those rectangles could change depending on how many options this particular NPC has. So what this bit of code does is it's resetting those rectangles back to what they were originally when we first read in the UIF file. This code here adds all of the children for this user interface to this resized children array, which is a bit of redundant code, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the next video. But for the time being, we're just adding the children to an array. And what that means is that we're adding all of these components. So the buttons, the scroll bar, all of these text objects, and all of the images, we're adding them to an array. The next thing we do is we grab the rectangles for the center image, which is the image right behind the text option that the player has. And then we grab the rectangle for that text option, which is this pink rectangle here. The reason why we do that is because we want the width of the text, the height of the text, the width of the image, and the height of the image. And so that's what this code does. I mentioned earlier in the video that you can use those rectangles to get the width and the height by just taking the right, subtracting the left, and taking the bottom, subtracting the top. Um, so the first menu option, we can use the objects that were created when the UIF file was first read in. And so that's what this particular code is doing. And that's also why this for loop starts at 1 and not 0, because the 0 option is using these objects which are created when the file was first read in. For all the other options, we're not given extra string objects, so we have to manually create them. So for all of the options which the server has sent us, we create a new string. We copy the string that was given to us when the GUI was first created. We copy it into the new string object we've created. We set its parent to the UIQuestMenu object. And then this is where we actually set the string of the option to the string that the server sent us previously that we read in up here. We actually set it. So now that string is actually being displayed in place of this here, which the player can actually click on, and it's actually being displayed and can be read now within the game. What this code is doing is it's shifting down the options. So the reason why we needed to know the text width and the image width is because we can use that to shift each of the options below the next. So you can imagine the second menu option should be below the first, the third should be below the second, so on and so forth. So we use this information to do that. Then we set the rectangle for that text to the rectangle that we just calculated, and then we push it to the resize children so that we can render it and do things with it later. This bit of code here is broken down into two sort of pieces. So this line gets the rectangle for the last menu option which we created. And the reason why we want that is because we need to resize these three images, and we need to know where to put the very bottom of the option GUI. And so by grabbing the rectangle for the very last text object, we can use its width and height to determine where the GUI should actually end so that it includes all of the options that the NPC has. So this is stretching, excuse me, this is stretching these three images so that they cover all the options. So that's what this first chunk of code is doing. And the second chunk of code is setting the three options for the very bottom of the GUI. So you can go through and read that. It's pretty simple. This code is split up into two pieces as well. So what this is doing is it's getting the width and the height of the viewport for the camera, and using the width and the height. So you can think of this as the width and the height of the window, the Windows window that gets created, that the game gets rendered into. And we get the region. This is the region of the full GUI. So you can see this pink rectangle here. It covers the entire thing. So when you get rectangle, you're going to get that rectangle there. You want to set the bottom of that now to the new bottom, because what's going to happen is as you add options here, this is actually going to get bigger. So the bottom of this is going to move down depending on how many options there are. So what you want to do is manually set that and then set the rectangle to this new calculated rectangle. And this is important because the way that these GUIs work is that in game, when you click on a certain region of the screen, it will take the root rectangle here, kind of the highest in the hierarchical chain, and then it'll run through the list to see which of the components you clicked on that were inside this larger rectangle. That way, whenever you click on the game, it's not doing a for loop over all the possible GUI components to see if you clicked on it. It's basically segregating them to certain regions of the window, and it's more efficient that way. And then this part below here is actually taking the GUI and positioning it in the center of the screen by taking the width and the height of the window, and then the width and the height of the GUI, and then setting the center that way. Okay, so that basically goes through the old GUI setup. It kind of demonstrates a little bit of how these GUIs work, how the components are being read in, what these rectangles are doing, so on and so forth. And how even with a GUI like this, code needs to be written in the client so that it's actually functional. So, you know, this file by itself will not do the job. You need this extra code here to actually make it something useful. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll look at this component, we'll read in the pieces that we need of this, and then actually get this working, which is slightly different than the previous one.